Welcome. I suppose everybody knows about the parking. The parking is that on Mondays you can't be on this side of the street. On Tuesdays you can't be on the other side of the street. On Wednesdays you can't be on the north-south stride. And on Thursdays you can't be on the west side. You look at the signs, and they're trying to save the lake. And so you have to be very careful because it is a $45 fine if you're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong place. Well, we can't provide meals for everyone because we just are not equipped to do that. So what happens is that every year people go out for lunch and they go out for dinner in the evening. And Roz put together these things for the vegetarian restaurants or restaurants that are vegetarian friendly. Unfortunately, this is from an entertainment magazine, and there's a lot of places that serve alcohol and such like that. But on the back page are places where you can get very good vegetarian food around the city, and so just help yourself to one of these whenever you want one. All right. Every year I take some topic out of the Rosicrucian philosophy and give 5 talks about it. And at this time I decided to do talks about the 4 Gospels. And it's an unusual topic for me because I do not usually do much with the Bible. I'm not a Bible authority, and I don't intend to be. And this is not going to be really a Bible study course. It's going to be much more a series of talks that is about the modern spiritual life. Now, I'm not unfamiliar with the Bible. I've read the entire Bible cover to cover twice. And the Gospels, I have probably read each of them a dozen times. And there was a time when I had a serious illness, and I read St. John's Gospel every day. So there are some very moving passages in the Gospels, and there are some very beautiful things, but I'm not very much a lover of the Bible, and I'm not really keen about it, especially the Old Testament. Max Heindel tells us about the Old Testament. The reason it is there is to show us what we have outgrown, to show us how to not live. But I don't even like that because it's a negative suggestion. It's like saying, look out, you're going to cut yourself. When you hear that, there's a negative suggestion. You're much too likely to take it on. So looking at the Old Testament is like looking at photographs of yourself as a teenager. When you did all those embarrassing things and things like that, you don't want to look back on it, and that's where the Old Testament is. It's a little different with the New Testament, but the New Testament is about, for the most part, 1,600 years old. It is not 2,000 years old. It is the most recent, or the most ancient copy that we have is of St. Mark's Gospel, and it's about 1,600 years old, so we don't go all the way back. Now, some of the material in the Gospels is timeless, but the way it is looked at is archaic, because people get better. And when we get better, our consciousness is clearer, and we understand more. And so to try to look at it, to keep it frozen in time, is against everything in nature that we see that goes on around us. Everything evolves, everything gets better and improves. the Gospels are, in their basic nature, they're symbolic. And we are at a time when symbolism is becoming obsolete. Funny thing, we're going to talk about the obsolescence of symbols by looking at the Bible. The Bible refers to what we call the fall of humanity, when we, in a very innocent but very primitive state, took the use of our portion of the creative force that creates, transforms, sustains, and dissolves the entire cosmos. We took that power into our hands before we know what to do with it. And so we put ourselves out of harmony with the divine plan. And we put ourselves out of harmony with nature. It doesn't take much to look at the human part of the world around us to see that it doesn't have all the harmonies that nature has. Everything in nature is harmonious, but our part isn't. Over many millennia, we became more focused outwardly as a result of the fall. We came more and more deeply into the material world. As a consequence, we lost the inner vision. It was intended that we were supposed to become outward, but not with losing the inner spiritual sight. And when we had the inner spiritual sight, we wouldn't make so many mistakes. You'd make a mistake and you'd only once and you'd learn. So by falling into matter, by becoming too materialistic, we lost the spiritual sight, but we still have need for spiritual guidance. When we think or when we emote, that's all inward. But the continuity of consciousness between the inner person or the inner being and the outer person is broken up. And so we need to have a way to realign our outer consciousness with the inner worlds. And that is what a symbol does. A symbol is something that we can perceive with our senses. And if a symbol is constructed correctly, it awakens an inner intuition in ourselves, and that inner intuition then lines up so that we can apperceive the spiritual truth behind the outer circumstance. Now, the intent is that we develop the inner spiritual perception again so that we gain what we had lost. So, right now, in our material state, we are so materialistic that most people in the world think that this stuff is all there is. And if we go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist and we start talking about things like we're talking about now, they're going to tell us that's crazy talk. And these are the people who decide whether we are sane or insane. So symbolism is a middle ground between the inner worlds and the outer world. It's something materially objective, and it has an intent to invite us into a spiritual meaning. And the symbol is valuable to the extent that it opens up inner meaning, and that it conveys something to our whole being. A really good symbol has many, many different meanings. Max Heindel tells us that the mystery symbols have meanings on several different levels, 7 levels at the same time. So it captures our attention and it leads us inward. But symbols themselves have an evolution. Some symbols are archaic. We look at them now and they don't move us at all. Other symbols have evolved and they have taken on different meanings. Jacob Boehme, who knew the Bible almost by heart from cover to cover, said that symbols are indeed becoming obsolete. He says it is the time now in our spiritual history that we should be seeing the spiritual verities directly. We should be seeing them straightforward and not needing to have something like a Bible or something symbolic. We should look at it the way that we look at outer nature. So he was very, very profound in his seership, but he thought this is the way that things should go. So in effect, he is saying, and Max Heindel of the Rosicrucian Fellowship is saying, that we should be moving away from symbolism and into direct spiritual perception. In fact, that's one of the reasons that the Rosicrucian Fellowship exists. It exists to help people to safely develop their inner spiritual faculties so that they can serve the whole creative process better. When you can see what's going on, you can do much better. You're not in the dark, as we like to say. All right. So, I am a person that believes that the Bible is becoming archaic and obsolete, and hopefully we can hasten that obsolescence. In the meantime, it is our work to use the symbolism that we have to get people to focus on the spiritual things so they can actually unfold. And some of that is what we're going to do. Now, when you study symbolic works, there are various different kinds of tools, symbolic tools or tools of symbolism. One of them is physiology and anatomy. The Rosicrucian cosmoconception tells us that even our very physical bodies and every organ in our body is the product of divine creative hierarchies, gods, so to speak, and that the different gods have developed different qualities in our bodies. It's pretty obvious, like for example, Libra rules the kidneys, and the kidneys are basically nets, and a net is cause and consequence in 3 dimensions. We hear stories of ghosts, and the ghosts are dragging their chains around, and those chains are cause and consequences linked together, and they're carrying them around because they haven't dissolved them yet in the inner worlds. But if you take a chain and you spread it out so that it goes in all directions, you have a network. And if you have a network that has the maximum amount of surface area, that's what the kidneys are. So that the blood rushes against the net, and the thinner part of the blood passes through the net, and the big molecules, protein molecules, fat molecules, slide down, and they become the urea. And so when we say then that the kidneys are ruled by Libra, and we know that Libra is the scales of justice. So we can say that the hierarchies, the divine hierarchies, they're called, the hierarchy for Libra is the lords of individuality. Those beings are right in the very function of our kidneys. And the same is true of every other hierarchy and every other part of our body. various beings rule them. Emanuel Swedenborg talks about this at great length. He has many books about the body of God and the different types of character you find with the different cells and the different kinds of body of the God. Emanuel Swedenborg is very tough to read because there's so much belief and not enough meaning in it. So, each part of the body represents a different kind of character. So if a person is decapitated and dies, that means one thing. Whereas if a person is stabbed in the heart, that means another. And if we look at the body of Jesus, it was pierced in the liver, and water came running out, which means he was decomposing already while he was on the cross, and it was a very swift decomposition because you can pierce the body anywhere and you don't find water running out of it. So what we're saying is that physiology is one way to interpret any kind of a myth, and that includes the Bible. The Bible is basically a myth. Another technique or another tool for interpreting a symbolic work is I gotta make sure this is right. Is numbers. Even the letters in which the Bible is constructed have numeric values. We're not talking about numerology, though it works with numerology, and we're not talking about Pythagorean number theory, which gives us a lot of understanding into things. We're talking about numbers that relate to characteristics in our consciousness and how they manifest in our body. So that when we read a passage in the Bible and it says there were 10 virgins, why were there 10 and not 7? Or not 5 or 12. When there are 10, it has a very specific meaning. Of course, we're not going to talk about that now because this is not a class in Bible study. This is just to titillate your interest so that you can study it if you like. All right. In these talks, we're going to see how astrology is a tool for understanding a symbolic work, and that is the Gospels. These talks are going to be very far-fetched. In some cases, they're not going to come close to the Gospels at all, because that's not what the intent is. This will be very fast, it will be superficial, and if you want something thorough and exhaustive, it would take a long, long time, and we don't have that. We have 5 talks, and that's all. Now, there are a lot of references to astrology in the Gospels. In all of the Bible, there are a lot of references to astrology. The fundamentalists don't like that, because, they're looking for something that has a meaning that stays the same forever, which is not like reality. But it's interesting to note that one of the best books that I have ever read on astrology and the Bible was written by a fundamentalist. And that man, I believe his name is George Adam. And he had really great astrological and cosmological understandings of the Bible, only his doubt was, you're not supposed to use astrology this way. He didn't say that astrology didn't work. He knew that it worked, but it just wasn't to be applied that way. And even that is not wrong. In some ways, we should be getting things from the Spirit directly and not needing to use something like astrology. Now, even though we're going to point to various astrological elements, in the Gospels, that's not our intent. Our intent as Christian mystics is understanding and living a spiritual life. It's nice to know about rebirth, and it's nice to know about the spiritual worlds and all of those things, but what really counts is the life that we live. That's all we have. Everything else can be taken away from us but our life. Our life may withdraw from this physical body, but spiritually all we have is our life, and our work is to live a life that is resonant with truth, that is resonant with the greater reality that we live in. So we're looking for something to live by. So in each of these talks, even though we're going to go very far afield into all kinds of astrology, we're going to try to point out one thing at least in every talk that is important for living a good life. The topic for the talk today is the Nativity. I suppose I could get out a Bible and read the various versions of the Nativity, but we all know who have studied astrology that Nativity means the astrological conditions at the time of birth. A horoscope, when you have your horoscope, that is called a nativity. What we're going to look at is the nativity of Christ in the Gospels. And there's a problem in that, a very big problem, in that you have to use the word nativities, because the nativity that is in Matthew's Gospel is very different from the nativity that is in Luke's Gospel. In fact, when they trace the lineage of Joseph in Matthew's Gospel, it's a much different lineage than the lineage of Joseph in Luke's Gospel. They're very different. They're not lineages of blood. They're not inheritance lineages. They are resolutions of consciousness from one state to another state. And then, on top of that, even though they talk about the lineage of Joseph in St. Matthew's Gospel, they say Jesus was born of a virgin. And most people think that means a physical, miraculous birth, a parthenogenesis. And then why would you have the lineage of Joseph if somebody is born of a virgin birth? It doesn't make any sense. That's why if you try to take the Gospels as historical records or biographical records, you're going to run into all sorts of problems. And suppose that virgin birth were really possible. It is possible. It happens in a lot of animals, especially fowl. Turkeys, for example, often have offspring by parthenogenesis. But they're always females. So then you run into the problem that if it was a true virgin birth, Jesus would have to have been a female, which would upset a lot of cultural people to think of something like that. This is a problem, we're not going to go into it. It's a problem that is so difficult that in some spiritual schools, it is even believed that there were two Jesus' children. That is not the teaching of the Rosicrucian Fellowship. Max Heindel says that by looking in the memory of nature, you can see that there was only one Jesus' child.
Richard?
Yeah.
Just quickly, Steiner.
Yeah, I know.
We could say he's a Rosicrucian initiate?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
He didn't.
So your feelings on his...
I think he was an initiate. I think he was an initiate, but I'm not sure certain.
But about the two Jesus children.
Yeah, I don't want to go into that. I do have a course that is going on right now, and there's a sub-series of talks called Christ in the Life Spirit, and we're going into all these things in very great depth and in very great detail, and we restart again in September, and there are recordings available if you want to get to them. Well, it's just me. All right. The point is that there are a lot of contradictions between the two nativities. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time fighting over these contradictions. It's sort of like in the book of Genesis, there are two origins of humans. In one of the stories in Genesis, humans are the first thing created. In another one of the stories, just a very few verses on, humans are the last things created. And they're talking about two different things. One is talking about an evolution of life, and another one is talking about an evolution of form. And unless you know this, the Bible seems contradictory. So these are things that, if you study the Bible, you have to be willing to look at many apparent contradictions. They're not errors. But the Bible is a spiritual book, and by looking at parts of it, it is meant to produce spiritual understandings. These things are very engaging. It's like trying to solve a mystery. You're drawn on, and then you think it's this way, and then all of a sudden something comes up, and the apple cart is upset, and it's all different. The fact is that in symbolic literature, in mythology, anything goes, and it's likely that things are going to happen. One of the reasons for this is if you have an incongruity between one thing and another, that leaves a gap in your consciousness. If there's too much continuity, there's no room for intuition to come in. There's no room to be open for something else. And if a symbolic work has an incongruity between symbols, that shocks your consciousness and gives you an opening for intuitive understanding. So that the Gospels are very, very wonderful in being able to do that. We're going to talk quite a bit more in the evening talks about the nature of the Gospels and the spiritual meanings. They're much more rich than these are. All right. The Rosicrucian philosophy, as taught by Max Heindel, issues from a Rosicrucian mystery school, which is in the inner spiritual worlds. And the only way that you can be invited into that school is if you can leave your body and function consciously in the inner planes. It's a mystery school, which means that it is esoteric. And it's esoteric. It means that it is secret. Part of the reason for the secrecy is to engage one. Part of the secrecy is to not spoil something for you, but so that when you discover it for yourself, it has that virgin feeling of being so wonderfully clear. Another reason for the secrecy is that we're incapable of understanding the spiritual things directly. Something is secret because we just can't understand it. So the Bible as a symbolic book, is not an open book. And that shouldn't surprise us, because the biblical Christ, as well as St. Paul, tell us that one thing is given out abroad to the people, and another understanding is given to the inner part, the inner students of spiritual things. In fact, it's such a thing that if you read when Christ interprets the parables were given to the public, and then he interprets them for the disciples. And when you look at those interpretations need interpretation. There's another level that goes beyond that. You can get neurotic about whether you understand it or whether you have the correct interpretation. Doubt is all right, but to be neurotic, it's closing yourself. Doubt causes you to ask questions, and when you ask questions, you produce a form that can receive the truth. But if you have a neurotic self-doubt, then there's not much that can come out of that. If you're going to read the Gospels in a spiritual way, you read them with faith. There have been many, many saints who have identified with the events in the life of Jesus as is portrayed in the Gospels, that by doing that, they have unfolded higher states of consciousness. And that's the better way to go at it. The better way to look at the Bible is to look at it by faith, and then by faith you actually begin to unfold spiritual experiences. All right. Max Heindel tells us that on midnight of Christmas Eve, on the eastern horizon, you find Virgo the Virgin. That is, if you're looking for most of the northern hemisphere. Now, this is something that if we use the intellectual zodiac, which is an invisible zodiac that never changes, you'll find this to always be true. In the time that we live now, according to the precession of the equinox, it still is pretty much true that at midnight on Christmas Eve you can see the constellation of Virgo beginning to rise. And Virgo is the Virgin, and this is one of the things of being what it means to be born of a virgin. At the time of the incarnation of Christ into the body of Jesus, this was much more true. The alignment was such that it was clearly Virgo on the horizon and Gemini at the midheaven. Now, this Max Heindel gives us this statement as a hint. And he tells us that there's much more to discover if we put in the work to discover it. But unfortunately, most of the Rosicrucian students that I've met, I've been studying now 51 years, and most of the Rosicrucian students I've met have never done that studying. And as a consequence, they have never pulled out all of the spiritual things that could be pulled out of something that Max Heindel suggested we should study. All right. Time to have show and tell. This is a chart that is very old and beat up, and it is a chart of the heavens. Now, if you hold it like this, and you put Virgo on the ascendant, then Gemini is at the midheaven. This is this chart of the heavens at Christmas time, on Christmas Eve. This is a pictorial star chart. There are many different varieties of them. I have several books out here that you can look at, and they all have different pictures. They're basically mostly different artistic conceptions, but some have different ideas of what the constellations are. This has been now for me for over 20 years. This has been sort of like a Bible for me, because understanding any mysteries, studying any mythology, studying Shakespeare, you can find the tie together and meanings between the different what you're trying to study, whatever cultural vehicle you're trying to study. You can find the relationship with the stars. What we're looking at is the nativity. You can get, if you can get ancient Egyptian maps or ancient Hindu maps, they have different constellations, and each one of them is really quite insightful if you look at them relative to the mythologies. Now, this is if you're looking at it like this, it's as if the North Pole is at your back and you're looking south. All of this is behind you or under the earth and you can't see it. These are the things that are above the earth from Gemini over to Virgo. Now, let's start looking at that. If you look to the right, here we have the cow and the sheep or the ram, and up here we have the shepherd with the shepherd's crook. Origa. So what we're talking about when in St. Luke's Gospel, when there were shepherds in the field and there were angels, literally that's what's in the heaven. So this is a diagram of the cosmic state of things. We're looking at the horoscope of Christ. Not the horoscope of Jesus, but the horoscope of Christ and the conditions that were necessary for humanity to evolve and move forward through the vehicle of Christ in Christianity, which is something much different than the Christian church is right now, but that's all right. They're doing something. So we can see then that the nativity is there. Even some of the things that are in the heavens. If we look up in here, we find Cephas, the king of Ethiopia, and Cassiopeia, his wife. And they are none other than Herod and his wife. And if we look over here, here is the head of Medusa that has been chopped off. Right under Cephas and Cassiopeia, which is John the Baptizer, who was beheaded by that mean king. So the whole story is just looking to the west as you're facing south. The whole nativity story is right there. That indicates the past, because those are stars that are setting. Now, what happens to the east? Now, if you get it, if you put the midheaven in just the right place, about the time of the incarnation, there were the three stars in the belt of Orion were just shy of the midheaven. For hundreds, if not thousands of years before the advent of Christ, those three stars were called the three kings. So when we talk about the three kings from the Orient, because now we're on the east side, and they're close enough to the midheaven so that on 12th night, 12 days later at midnight, they are right at the midheaven. So the foreshadowing of what the future is going to be is in the east, and those are the stars that are rising. So we can see that in the east, the new kingdom and all of that is coming. The future is indicated. Putting this all together. This is just very abbreviated. This is another teaser like Max Heindel would give you. This is something that if you want to understand the Bible and if you want to understand the cosmic environment that we live in, get yourself a chart like this and start looking at it and pondering it, and it's a wonderfully fulfilling activity. So, this part of the heaven, which is visible at midnight and Christmas Eve, gives a picture of a segment of the evolutionary creation that we are living in over a few thousand years, what has come before us when we were simple-minded peasant people, and when we're later on getting to the time of kings, Regulus and Leo and all of that, where it's an indication of what is to come. In fact, even Virgo is going to come to the midheaven. And if you look at the other end of the Bible, you have in the Apocalypse, you have the Virgo symbol with the woman with in travail with the sun and the moon under her 2 feet. It's all right there. Okay. If you want to look at this, pass it around. And it's awfully beat up. It's gotten a lot of use. So our simple past is an easy thing to understand, but the future that is before us is not so easy to understand, and that is intended that way. We have to be subjective about the future. About the past, we must always be objective, because if we get subjective about the past, we're sentimentalizing and we're not seeing the fact. History of the past and what has happened before is objective. It is very objective. But if we try to take the past and build it into the future, that's a big mistake. We must be subjectively receptive, because the future is something new. It's something unexpected. And by taking in or receiving or accepting the future, that's the better attitude to have. We as human beings tend to be too assuming, and an assuming personality is not a spiritual personality. A receptive personality is a spiritual personality. All right. We have said that the 3 kings are wise men. In fact, they are a group of stars that are part of a paranathalon. And a paranathalon is a collection of bright stars that are not exclusively on the zodiac. We're talking about stargazing now. And paranathalons are such that they all rise at the same time. And the paranathalons, which include Betelgeuse and Regulus, not Regulus, but Rigel and Betelgeuse and the 3 kings, and the bright star is Sirius. They're all rise at about the same time. And that group of 9 stars are called the 9 wise men. And they are called the 9 worthies. And this is something that goes way back into pre-Christian times. There were actually, and supposedly there still are, 9 wise men. It goes back to King Asok, who was the most puissant king of his time in India. And he was a Buddhist. And he went to war with another king, sort of like, it was like the Super Bowl of kings, and to make one big gigantic kingdom. And Asok won the battle, but before his own eyes, he saw 10,000 of his warriors die. And he said that he would never go to war again, and that all of the wealth of his kingdom would be spent in wisdom. And so he produced the 9 teachers. Each had a specialty of that he taught, and they studied, and then they infiltrated society, and as they passed on, they gave their wisdom over to someone else, and supposedly to this day, the 9 wise men are still existing. What we're talking about with wise men is we're talking about people who have knowledge, people who have intellect, and have combined that with spirituality. And the fact that the 9 wise men were all near the midheaven in their ascendancy means that Christ was ushering in a season of great wisdom, a season of great knowledge. And this is even indicated right in the star patterns. On one hand, at the midheaven, you have Gemini, and at the ascendant, you have Virgo, and those are both mercurial signs, indicating again that these are signs of knowledge and of education. This even holds true of the Gospels. St. Luke's Gospel, Luke as a Gospeler is associated with Taurus, whereas St. Matthew as a Gospeler is associated with Aquarius. And it is St. Matthew's Gospel that is more to the east, and St. Luke's that is more to the west. And the whole idea is that the Aquarian ideal was on the ascendancy. And it's not surprising then that science should come into being in the Christian era and play the big part that it is. From this we can see, we could go on and on and on, and we could go into little vignettes, and there are people that do it. There are people that take little groups of stars out of the heavens, and they find the Hebrew alphabet. And you cut an arc this way, and you get a passage of meaning of a given type. You cut this way, and you get another one. It's really literally reading the handwriting on the wall. And you look at these symbols by cutting, like those lewins that look like segments of orange. If you go from the North Pole or from the pole to the ecliptic down to the ecliptic, they tell stories. So what we're talking about here, we've opened up something that you can spend several lifetimes going into. It's such an enormously deep study. But that's not what we're about. We could get all sorts of things, but what we want to get, and why this was brought in to begin with, is we want to get the big picture. We don't want to miss the forest from having looked at individual trees. The fact is that it is not an accident that this big picture was put out for the world at the time of the incarnation. There are no spiritual accidents. What we're looking at is a cosmic event of great importance. But the fact is that when we look at any horoscope at all is relating our puny little lives to the cosmic life. And that's important, because we get so wrapped up in our little personal existence that we lose sight of the big picture. And the big picture is the meaning of the whole cosmos. Again, putting ourselves in harmony with the whole cosmos, even if it's a simple thing like being a farmer and being in touch with the seasons. That's a healthy thing to do, and if you can do that with your consciousness, it's so much the better. Now, at this point, when I was making these notes, it dawned on me that I hadn't really made it clear that we're talking about the horoscope of Christ and not the horoscope of Jesus. Jesus supposedly was a Libra, and even that has significance because Libra is the turning point between the two major seasons. It is the Omega point. Jesus is a human leader, but the cosmic Christ, the life spirit, the living representation of the life spirit, is what is important. We want to understand that life through the little vignettes that take place in the Gospels, but to see that life on its own, for its own. So we're looking, too often we personalize our lives. We look at things from our own personal point of view. Whereas if we get the Christ consciousness, Christ is the selfhood of all the selves. It is a selfness out of which all the individual selves are born. And that is a very, very important thing. That means that's the only place that one can come to complete and total objectivity. But that objectivity is unconditioned, such that the Buddhists see it as void of any kind of conditioning of any kind at all. But what this is trying to do is, by looking at the nativity, is trying to lift us out of our petty personal existences. And if we understand that if the stars are bodies of great divine beings, like the God of our solar system, that is our aim and purpose for everything in our human evolution, if each of the stars and all of the constellations are manifesting in that kind of objectivity, we have to look at our lives. We have to live a noble kind of life. We have to live a life of dignity, because our lives are attuned to the great cosmic life. And that's something we don't always do. We tend to get lost in our own little affairs. We don't live according to cosmic standards. We don't live according to the astrological mandala. So even though the Gospels are not biographies, a lot of people have tried to live according to some of the examples in the Gospels. If you read the lives of saints, almost all of the lives of saints are based on reliving the life of Christ Jesus in their own little ways. Now, it didn't bother saints that there were inconsistencies. They knew that there was a truth, and that was an objective truth that took them beyond their human understanding. And the inconsistencies are part of the little human part of it all. So, we are aspirants to being Christian mystics. And it is important for us that we live these kinds of lives, that we have the cosmos in mind, that we look at the stars, that we look at the nativity and use it for guiding our lives. That's about all we have this morning. You might say, you could sum it all up, that we should have a cosmic perspective and bring it into all the little details of our life. Think globally, act locally. We'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Well, thank you very much. What?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
All right. You're saying that the Virgo rising for the horoscope of Christ.
Yes.
Is this the intellectual horoscope? At the time of the birth of Jesus, which I've seen some astrologers peg as a super conjunction in Pisces. Have you ever seen that?
You're talking about things that are going to come up in future days.
Okay. All right. I'll leave it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We were talking.
No, it's very interesting. I just.
Yeah.
You wouldn't dispute that.
No.
Okay.
In fact, the next 2.25 days, we're going to be talking about one thing. The star.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Fun! I think we'll gradually start picking people up as the week goes on. Tim will probably be here tomorrow. Now,